The town of Fairhaven had always been an unremarkable place, the kind of sleepy, tree-lined community where everyone knew everyone else's business and life moved at a predictable, comfortable pace. It was the last place one might expect to become the center of a story that would shake not only its residents, but also the world. Yet, one summer evening, the unthinkable happened, altering the lives of those who lived there forever. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Jacob Miller was an ordinary boy by all accounts. 14 years old, lanky and shy, he spent most of his time tinkering with gadgets in his room or biking around the neighborhood. His parents, Amanda and Daniel, doted on him, their only child. They believed Jacob's quiet demeanor masked a brilliant mind and a tender heart. On that fateful evening, however, their hopes and dreams for Jacob's future came crashing down. It began like any other day. Jacob had spent the morning helping his father fix the old family car. By the afternoon, he had set off to explore the woods at the edge of town, a usual pastime that soothed his restless curiosity. Hours passed, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob's parents began to worry. It wasn't like him to stay out so late without telling them. When night fell and Jacob still hadn't returned, panic gripped the Millers. A search party was organized. Neighbors scoured the woods, flashlights sweeping through the dense foliage. It was nearly midnight when they found him, lying motionless at the base of a steep ravine. The paramedics pronounced him dead on the scene, his body eerily unscathed save for a faint bruise on his temple. Amanda collapsed in grief, her cries echoing through the forest. The days that followed were a blur of sorrow and disbelief. The funeral was held at the town's small church, where pews overflowed with mourners. Jacob's classmates wept openly, clutching one another for comfort. As his casket was lowered into the ground, Amanda whispered a final goodbye, her voice breaking. Little did anyone know, this would not be the end of Jacob's story. 3 days after the funeral, in the dead of night, a strange sound erupted from the Millers' backyard, a deep, guttural gasp that startled Amanda awake. She rushed outside and froze, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing barefoot on the dewy grass, was Jacob. His eyes, wide and luminous, seemed to pierce through her. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair clung damply to his forehead. He looked both exactly like her son and yet profoundly different. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. "We need to talk. There isn't much time." Amanda's mind refused to process what she was seeing. She stumbled backward, nearly fainting, before Daniel appeared behind her, equally stunned. Jacob stepped forward, his movements hesitant but deliberate. "I don't have long," he said, his tone now more forceful. "I've been sent back to warn you, to warn everyone." The boy they buried days earlier was alive. It was a miracle, or so everyone thought. But as Jacob began to recount what had happened to him, it became clear this was no ordinary resurrection. His voice quaked as he described waking up in a place that defied human understanding. He called it the void, a realm of blinding light and deafening silence where time stretched endlessly and yet felt non-existent. There, he said, he stood before a presence, immense and all-encompassing, that filled him with equal parts love and terror. "They showed me everything," Jacob explained, his gaze distant as if reliving the experience. "Every choice, every sin, every moment humanity has ever ignored the truth. And then they showed me what's coming." He spoke of the Rapture, a biblical prophecy he had barely understood before his death. The images he described were vivid and horrifying. A world plunged into chaos, skies split open by fire, and an unstoppable force sweeping away the faithful while leaving the rest to face unspeakable horrors. He saw cities crumble, oceans churn with blood, and the earth itself groan under the weight of divine wrath. "It's real," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and it's closer than anyone thinks." Word of Jacob's return spread quickly through Fairhaven. People flocked to the Miller's house, desperate to catch a glimpse of the boy who had cheated death. Jacob, now a reluctant prophet, began sharing his message with anyone who would listen. He spoke with a wisdom and intensity far beyond his years, warning of the need for repentance and unity. But his warnings were not always met with acceptance. Some dismissed him as a fraud, a disturbed teenager seeking attention. Others accused the Millers of staging an elaborate hoax. Yet there were those who believed their faith renewed or ignited by Jacob's words. The local church, once sparsely attended, overflowed with worshipers seeking solace. Pastor Reeves, a skeptical but compassionate man, became one of Jacob's staunchest allies, organizing nightly vigils and urging the town to prepare their hearts for what lay ahead. The skeptics grew louder as days turned into weeks. Medical professionals, theologians, and even journalists descended upon Fairhaven, each with their own theories. Was Jacob a miracle? A victim of brain trauma? A harbinger of doom? The boy remained steadfast, his warnings becoming more urgent and specific. He spoke of dates, events and signs, earthquakes, eclipses, and plagues that would precede the rapture. And then, one by one, those signs began to manifest. The second sign came days later. A blood-red moon that hung low in the sky, visible to every corner of the globe. News outlets scrambled to explain the phenomenon, citing atmospheric conditions and refraction. But to those who had heard Jacob's warnings, it was undeniable proof. Fairhaven itself became a microcosm of the world's reaction. Families were torn apart as belief clashed with skepticism. Longtime friends turned on one another, arguments erupting over whether to heed Jacob's message or dismiss it as hysteria. Amanda and Daniel found themselves at odds, their once solid marriage cracking under the strain of their son's strange return. Through it all, Jacob grew weaker. His once bright eyes dimmed, and his frail body seemed unable to sustain the weight of his message. "I'm not meant to stay," he told Amanda one evening as she cradled him in her arms. "I was only sent to warn you, to give you a chance." His parents found him in his room, lying peacefully on his bed, a faint smile on his lips. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of what had taken him. Beside him lay a piece of paper, its surface covered in scrawled handwriting. It was his final message, a plea for humanity to turn away from greed, hatred, and indifference before it was too late. Fairhaven was never the same after Jacob. His story spread far beyond the small town, sparking debates, conversions, and controversies worldwide. For some, he was a modern-day prophet, a vessel of divine warning. For others, he was a tragic boy caught in the throes of a delusion. But for those who had looked into his eyes and heard his trembling voice, one truth remained unshakable. Jacob had seen something, and whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on all who encountered him. As the world moved on, Amanda and Daniel clung to their son's memory, their grief tempered by a newfound resolve. They kept his words alive, sharing his message with anyone willing to listen. For in their hearts they knew Jacob's return had not been in vain. He had been a bridge between the seen and the unseen, a reminder that even in the face of the unknown, there is always a choice, to believe, to change, and to prepare. And perhaps they hoped that choice would make all the difference. After Jacob's second departure, Fairhaven became a town in limbo, caught between the echoes of his warnings and the unbearable silence that followed. Those who had heard his words could not simply forget them even if they wanted to. The boy had been an enigma, a fleeting connection to a world beyond comprehension. For Amanda and Daniel Miller, the days after Jacob's final passing felt like an endless dusk, a time when the sun neither rose nor set but hovered, leaving them in shadow. The note Jacob left behind became a sacred artifact, passed from hand to trembling hand. Written in hurried scrawls, it wasn't simply a warning, it was a call to action. It spoke of love, repentance, and the urgency of unity. But the words also carried a haunting truth. Humanity's time to prepare was running short. Some who read it felt a peace settle over them, a reassurance that they had been given a chance to set things right. Others felt only dread, the weight of Jacob's visions pressing down on their souls. Amanda, once a woman of quiet faith, became consumed with deciphering every word her son had written. She pored over the Bible, comparing passages to Jacob's descriptions of the rapture and the void. She marked up her family's old copy, pages dog-eared and margins filled with her frantic notes. The more she read, the more certain she became that Jacob had been chosen for a divine purpose. Yet this certainty came with a price. Her grief over his loss festered, twisting into a relentless drive to ensure his message was not ignored. Daniel, on the other hand, retreated into himself. A man of logic and reason, he could not reconcile what had happened to his son. In quiet moments, he would stare at the sky, searching for answers in its infinite expanse. He found none. As Amanda threw herself into her newfound mission, Daniel's silence grew heavier. The once strong bond between them frayed, stretched thin by their opposing ways of coping. Fairhaven itself began to change in subtle but unsettling ways. The church, once a beacon of solace, became a battleground for competing interpretations of Jacob's message. Pastor Reeves tried to maintain order, but his sermons were often interrupted by heated arguments among the congregation. A group of fervent believers, calling themselves Jacob's Witnesses, began holding nightly vigils in the woods where the boy had been found. They claimed the site was sacred ground, and that those who prayed there might receive their own visions. Not everyone in Fairhaven was convinced. Skeptics, emboldened by the passage of time without further signs, began to push back. Some accused the witnesses of exploiting Jacob's story for attention. Others mocked the Millers, suggesting that their grief had driven them to fabricate the entire ordeal. A few even went so far as to vandalize the makeshift shrine that had been erected in the woods, tearing down photographs and scattering flowers into the dirt. The divide between believers and doubters deepened when another sign occurred. One autumn evening, the sky over Fairhaven was lit by what witnesses described as a burning cross of light. The phenomenon lasted only minutes but was seen by nearly everyone in town. To some, it was undeniable proof of Jacob's warnings. To others, it was a natural but rare atmospheric event, exaggerated by hysteria. Scientists offered explanations: solar flares, unusual cloud formations. But their reassurances fell flat in the face of the town's growing unease. Among the believers, a sense of urgency took hold. They began preparing for what they called the Great Reckoning. Families stockpiled food and water, converted basements into shelters, and burned old debts and grievances in symbolic acts of purification. Rumors spread of secret gatherings where followers claimed to have heard voices, seen visions, or experienced miraculous healings. Amanda found herself drawn into these circles, seeking solace among those who shared her faith in Jacob's message. She became a figurehead of sorts, her quiet determination inspiring others to take action. She spoke at meetings, her voice steady despite the tears that often welled in her eyes. "This is not a time for fear," she would say, clutching Jacob's note. "It's a time for hope. He came back for us. Let's not waste the chance he gave." But Daniel grew increasingly distant from Amanda's newfound role. He watched from the sidelines, his heart heavy with a mixture of skepticism and sorrow. He couldn't bring himself to believe in divine warnings, yet he couldn't deny the changes he saw in the town or in his wife. Their once shared grief had become a chasm and neither knew how to bridge it. As winter approached, the tension in Fairhaven reached a boiling point. The skeptics, tired of what they saw as the town's descent into madness, began organizing their own meetings. They argued that the signs could be explained by science or dismissed as coincidences. They demanded an end to the vigils and shrine building, accusing the believers of fostering paranoia and neglecting practical concerns. One particularly heated meeting ended in a brawl, with chairs overturned and voices raised in anger. The town council attempted to mediate, but their efforts only highlighted how fractured the community had become. Fairhaven, once a place of neighborly trust, now felt like a powder keg, one spark away from explosion. Amid this turmoil, Amanda made a decision that would change everything. She announced that she would lead a pilgrimage to the ravine where Jacob had been found. She believed that by returning to the place where his journey began, they might find clarity, or even a new sign. Her announcement drew both fervent support and fierce opposition. Some saw it as an act of faith, others viewed it as dangerous folly. The night of the pilgrimage was bitterly cold. A group of over 100 people gathered at the edge of the woods, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Amanda stood at the front, holding a lantern that cast flickering shadows across the trees. Daniel stood at a distance, torn between his love for his wife and his disbelief in her cause. As the group made their way into the forest, the mood was somber yet electric. Whispers filled the air, prayers murmured under breath. The path to the ravine was treacherous, and several people stumbled, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. When they finally reached the clearing, Amanda knelt at the spot where Jacob had been found. She closed her eyes and began to pray, her voice breaking the silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The crowd stood still, their faces a mixture of expectation and doubt. And then, just as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon, a sound unlike anything they had ever heard echoed through the ravine. It was a low, resonant hum, growing louder and more intense until it seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. Some fell to their knees weeping while others looked around in terror. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. In the silence that followed, a single voice rang out, a voice that sounded eerily like Jacob's. "Prepare!" The word hung in the air, reverberating through the clearing, and then it was gone, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. The crowd stood in stunned silence, the enormity of what they had experienced sinking in. For Amanda, it was the confirmation she had been waiting for. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "He's still with us." But for others, the experience raised more questions than answers. Had they truly heard Jacob's voice? Or was it a collective hallucination, born of their shared desperation? In the days that followed, the events at the ravine became the subject of intense debate. The believers saw it as undeniable proof of Jacob's message, a final warning to prepare for the rapture. The skeptics remained unconvinced, arguing that the hum could have been caused by geological activity or some other natural phenomenon. Despite their differing interpretations, one thing was clear: the divide in Fairhaven was now insurmountable. The town splintered into factions, each retreating into its own echo chamber of belief or denial. Friendships crumbled, families were torn apart, and the once close-knit community became a battlefield of ideologies. Amanda, undeterred by the conflict, continued to spread Jacob's message with unwavering determination. She organized prayer groups, distributed copies of his note, and even traveled to neighboring towns to share her story. Her faith gave her strength, but it also isolated her from those who couldn't or wouldn't believe. Daniel, unable to reconcile his love for Amanda with his disbelief in her mission, finally made the decision to leave Fairhaven. He packed a small bag, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I need to find my own answers." Amanda found the note the next morning and wept, her tears a mixture of sadness and resignation. She knew she couldn't force Daniel to believe, just as she couldn't force the world to heed Jacob's warning. All she could do was hold on to her faith and hope that it would be enough. As the year drew to a close, Fairhaven became a ghost of its former self. The streets were quiet, the shops half empty. But the legacy of Jacob Miller lived on, his story spreading far beyond the boundaries of the small town. Books were written, documentaries filmed, and debates held in universities and places of worship around the world. For some, Jacob's story was a reminder of the fragility of life and the mysteries that lie beyond it. For others, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of belief. But for Amanda, it was something far simpler, a testament to the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son, and the hope that even in the face of darkness, there is light to be found. As the shadow of Jacob's warnings lengthened over the lives of those in Fairhaven and beyond, the world outside the small town began to take notice in profound ways. At first, Jacob's story was a curiosity, whispered among conspiracy theorists, religious scholars, and those who delighted in tales of the inexplicable. However, as more of the signs he described seemed to manifest, bizarre weather patterns, unexplained phenomena, and geopolitical upheavals, the whispers grew louder. The world, already primed by uncertainty, began to ask if perhaps there was something to his dire prophecy. For Amanda Miller, the sudden global interest in her son's story was both a validation of his purpose and a painful reminder of his absence. She found herself in the unfamiliar role of a reluctant spokesperson, fielding calls from journalists, theologians, and even government officials. They wanted answers she didn't have. Her nights became sleepless marathons of prayer and research, poring over Jacob's note, the Bible, and every scrap of knowledge she could find about the rapture. The frenzy reached a fever pitch when an investigative journalist named Martin Keene arrived in Fairhaven. Keene was a hardened skeptic, a man known for exposing frauds and dismantling elaborate hoaxes. His presence sent ripples through the fractured community. The believers saw him as a test of faith, while the skeptics welcomed him as an ally in their quest to debunk the phenomenon. Amanda was wary of Keene. He arrived at her doorstep with his leather-bound notebook and recording device, his sharp eyes assessing her like a subject under a microscope. Yet something in his demeanor suggested he wasn't entirely immune to doubt. He asked questions not only with the intent to challenge, but also with a curiosity that seemed almost reluctant. "Mrs. Miller," he began one evening as they sat in her modest living room, "you've become the face of this movement. Do you ever question it? Do you ever wonder if maybe grief has played a role in all of this?" Amanda stared into her teacup, the steam curling around her face. "Grief," she said softly, "shaped my life long before Jacob died. Losing him twice didn't just make me desperate. It made me see things I'd been too afraid to see. I believe because I know he wasn't lying. I know because I was his mother." Her conviction unnerved Keene, though he didn't say so. He spent weeks in Fairhaven, interviewing residents, observing their rituals, and documenting every detail of Jacob's story. What he found defied easy explanation. For every skeptic with a plausible theory, there was a believer with an experience too visceral to dismiss. A vision, a dream, a moment of unexplainable peace or terror. One night, Keene himself had an encounter that left him shaken. While walking alone through the woods near the ravine, he felt an overwhelming sense of presence, as though the air around him had thickened and grown alive. The trees seemed to whisper, their leaves rustling in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. He dismissed it as his imagination, but deep down, the experience unsettled him. Meanwhile, Fairhaven's divisions deepened further. Amanda's growing prominence among believers drew both admiration and resentment. Some accused her of exploiting Jacob's story for attention, while others placed her on a pedestal, treating her as a saint-like figure. The strain weighed heavily on her, but she soldiered on, convinced that her son's message was too important to abandon. Beyond Fairhaven, the ripple effects of Jacob's story began to manifest in startling ways. Across the globe, religious revivals surged, drawing millions into churches, mosques, and synagogues. People of all faiths sought answers, finding common ground in their shared sense of unease. At the same time, others rejected these movements, turning instead to nihilism or hedonism, convinced that the end was inevitable and meaningless. Governments and institutions scrambled to address the rising tide of fear and speculation. Emergency broadcasts reassured citizens that the strange occurrences were natural phenomena or coincidences, but these explanations rang hollow. Social media became a battleground of ideas, with believers sharing Jacob's warnings alongside footage of purported signs, while skeptics debunked and derided them. Amanda's life changed irrevocably when an invitation arrived from an international symposium on unexplained phenomena to be held in Geneva. Scholars, scientists, and religious leaders from around the world would gather to discuss the growing wave of apocalyptic beliefs. Amanda initially hesitated. The idea of leaving Fairhaven, of standing before an audience of doubters and critics, terrified her. But as she held Jacob's note in her hands, she felt a flicker of resolve. She would go, not to argue, but to bear witness. The symposium was a whirlwind of intellect and ideology. Amanda found herself seated alongside physicists, theologians, and psychologists, each offering their perspective on the events surrounding Jacob's return. Some spoke of mass hysteria, while others proposed theories about parallel dimensions or energy fields. Amanda listened quietly, her presence a reminder that the phenomenon they debated was not just a theoretical puzzle, but a lived experience. When it was her turn to speak, the room fell silent. She stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly, and began to recount Jacob's story. She spoke not as a scholar or a preacher, but as a mother, a woman whose son had returned to her with a message she could not ignore. Her words were simple, heartfelt, and unadorned, and they struck a chord. "I don't have the answers you're looking for," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know why Jacob was chosen, or why he came back to us for such a brief time, but I do know this. He saw something that changed him, and through him, it changed me. If even a fraction of what he said is true, then we cannot afford to ignore it. We must choose to be better, to love better." Her speech was met with a mixture of applause and skepticism, yet for many in the audience, her sincerity was undeniable. Amanda returned to Fairhaven exhausted but resolute. She had planted a seed, even if she might never see it grow. As months turned into years, the world moved on, as it always does. Jacob's story became part of the fabric of modern mythology, debated and dissected but never forgotten. Amanda remained in Fairhaven, tending to the small garden she had planted near the ravine where Jacob had been found. She spent her days in quiet reflection, her heart both heavy with loss and lightened by hope. One spring morning, as Amanda walked through the woods, she felt a familiar presence, a warmth that wrapped around her like an embrace. She paused, her breath catching. The air seemed to shimmer, and for a fleeting moment she heard a voice, soft and distant but unmistakable. "Thank you, Mom." Tears streamed down her face as she stood there, alone but not alone. She didn't know what the future held or if Jacob's warnings would ever fully come to pass. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Love, in all its forms, was the only thing that truly endured, and in that knowledge, she found peace. The voice lingered in Amanda's heart long after it had faded into the rustle of the forest. For days, she replayed the moment in her mind, not in search of proof, but as a source of quiet strength. It wasn't just the words that stayed with her, but the undeniable warmth. The sense that Jacob, wherever he was, had not truly left her. That fleeting connection was enough to sustain her, though she knew it was not something she could share. Some moments were too sacred, too intimate to be explained or validated by others. Fairhaven, now a shadow of its former self, had settled into a strained equilibrium. The believers continued their vigils and prayers, while the skeptics carried on with their lives, growing quieter in their objections, but no less firm in their disbelief. The town had become a living metaphor for the world at large, divided but somehow coexisting, each faction resigned to the impossibility of convincing the other. Yet amid this tension, Amanda found solace in the garden she tended near the ravine. She had begun the project out of necessity, seeking a physical outlet for her grief and energy. But as the seasons passed, the garden became something more, a sanctuary, a living tribute to Jacob's memory. She planted flowers in vibrant reds and yellows, their colors defiant against the muted backdrop of the woods. Herbs grew in neat rows, their fragrance mingling with the earth. A single willow tree, young but resilient, stood at the heart of it all, its slender branches swaying like Jacob's own playful gestures. Visitors came from time to time, drawn by whispers of Amanda's resolve or the lingering pull of Jacob's story. Some brought offerings, candles, letters, even sketches of Jacob based on descriptions from those who had seen him. Others came with questions, seeking clarity or reassurance, but Amanda offered neither. Instead, she listened, her presence a reminder that the answers they sought could not always be spoken aloud. One such visitor was a young woman named Elena, who arrived on a rainy afternoon, her hands trembling as she cradled a faded leather journal. She explained that she had been experiencing vivid dreams, visions that bore eerie similarities to Jacob's descriptions of the void. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," she confessed, her voice breaking. "But then I read about your son and I thought, maybe I'm not alone." Amanda didn't respond right away. Instead, she led Elena to the willow tree and encouraged her to sit beneath its branches. Together they sat in silence as the rain softened to a drizzle. Finally, Amanda spoke. "You're not alone," she said simply, "but understanding what you've seen might take a lifetime, and that's okay. Some truths aren't meant to be rushed." Elena left with a quiet smile, her steps steadier than when she had arrived. Amanda watched her disappear into the trees, a faint hope blooming in her chest. For all the sorrow Jacob's message had brought, it had also become a beacon, a light for those lost in their own darkness. The seasons turned, and Amanda aged, her hair silvering and her movements slowing. The garden flourished, its vibrant blooms a testament to her enduring spirit. Though the world outside remained chaotic, she found her peace in the rhythm of the earth, in the cycle of planting and harvest. And in the quiet hours, when the wind carried whispers through the trees, she felt Jacob's presence, a constant and unyielding reminder that love endured beyond time, beyond fear, and even beyond death. As the years passed, the small town of Fairhaven began to fade further into the background of the world's larger narrative. Its name, once uttered in hushed tones of awe or skepticism, was now seldom mentioned in the media or public discourse. But within the town itself, the memory of Jacob's message and the impact of his brief return still rippled beneath the surface. Amanda's life had become a quiet pilgrimage, her days filled with small rituals and quiet observations. She'd long stopped seeking external validation, knowing that some experiences could not be captured by words or understood by the masses. She had come to accept that the world was full of mysteries that no human mind could fully comprehend. Her health, too, had begun to show signs of age. A slight limp had developed in her step, the result of years of walking the uneven paths through the woods. She no longer had the stamina to work the garden as she once had, but still, she tended it carefully. The willow tree, which she had planted in memory of Jacob, had grown tall, its branches now a sweeping canopy, offering shade and comfort to all who visited. It had become a symbol of continuity in her life, a living testament to the roots that had been set down, not only in the soil, but in the hearts of the people who had heard Jacob's message and allowed it to shape their lives. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on a young boy returning from death with a rapture warning? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.